Leo Gelfand, Leo as his mother had called him until her passing, lived a quiet, almost invisible life. It resembled a long dusty road where wildflowers once bloomed along the edges, though now you couldn't even recall their names. He was like a book not one, with a bright cover displayed prominently, but one pushed to the farthest corner of a shelf, its pages yellowed, preserving not so much a story as the scent of time itself. His biography fit into a few lines. Born, studied at Columbia's Department of Philology, worked in the university library, then as a junior researcher in the archives retired. Married to Kate, a quiet woman with kind eyes. They had a son who grew up and moved to another city to build his own loud, entirely different life. That's it. If anyone had tried to write his life story, they'd have fallen asleep by page 2 out of boredom. But inside Leo, behind his ribs where others had a beating heart, lived memory. Memoria predator that never ages, never loses its teeth. And so today, at 72, Leo Gelfand stood in the stuffy banquet hall of the Writers' Guild. It smelled of dusty drapes, old parquet floors, and expensive perfume from the new era. People bustled around faces familiar from TV, voices accustomed to lecturing from podiums. They sipped champagne, ate tiny caviar sandwiches, and talked incessantly. Leo didn't drink or eat. He stood by a column, a straight-backed, wiry old man in his only decent suit, feeling as out of place as an old dictionary in the glossy magazine section. He'd been invited. An official invitation on embossed paper, a celebration honoring Irene Pavlovna Voronin, the foremost philologist of our time, winner of every conceivable award, a living legend. Irenka? To him, she remained forever that same girl with too tight braids who sat beside him in Professor Zaslavsky's lectures, secretly passing him notes. Their youth belonged to the 60s, a time when the air crackled with hope. They weren't just classmates, they were comrades in arms, two musketeers ready to storm the bastions of stale academia. Leo, thoughtful, brilliant boy from an intellectual Jewish family, able to quote ancient Greek poets on the fly. Irenea bright, driven girl from the provinces with blazing eyes and a wolfish tenacity. She'd clawed her way into the city, into the university, into Leo's life. He'd loved her to the point of trembling, to speechlessness. His love was quiet, bookish. He dedicated his first clumsy translations to her, read her poems late at night in the dorm until the R.A. banged a broom handle on the ceiling. Her love was different, practical, earthly. She saw in him not just a sensitive soul, but a passport into the world of true intellectuals, into the circle of their shared idol Professor Zaslavsky, Arkady Borisovich. Zaslavsky was a titan, a man who embodied an era. His lectures on comparative linguistics felt like theatre. He didn't lecture, he thought aloud, and only the brightest could keep up with the flight of his mind. Leo was his favorite. The professor saw in him his successor, the one who could carry his ideas forward. Irene also gravitated towards the professor, but Zaslavsky, with his old man's insight, saw right through her. "This girl, Leo," he'd say, chewing his thin lips, "has too many elbows and too little heart. Beware of her." Leo didn't beware. How do you beware of the air you breathe? They spent evenings together in the professor's book-cluttered apartment overlooking Riverside Drive. They drank tea with crackers and talked about eternal things. Zaslavsky shared drafts of his magnum opus, the work of his life, research on proto-language that was meant to revolutionize linguistics. He entrusted Leo with his manuscripts, his most intimate thoughts. Irene sat beside him, listening intently, nodding, her eyes burning with a cold, calculating fire. Trouble came, as always, unexpectedly. The professor had a stroke. He didn't die, but became a frail old man with vacant eyes and a paralyzed right side. His mind, his brilliant mind, became a dark, locked house. Zaslavsky's archive, all his manuscripts, card files, drafts, remained sealed in his apartment. Leo was shattered. He visited the hospital, tried to talk to the professor, who only mumbled in response. Irene visited too, bringing oranges, but her grief seemed busy, bustling. One evening she came to Leo's tiny room in the communal apartment. She sat down on a chair, her brows set firmly. "Leo," she said in her low, persuasive voice, "we have to save his work. It's our duty." "How?" he whispered. "Everything's sealed. His daughter from America won't come soon, and then it'll all be pulped." "I have a key," Irene said quietly. "He gave it to me once, just in case. We have to take the archive, discreetly. Tonight." Leo was terrified. It was wrong, dishonest. It was theft. But Irene knew how to persuade. She spoke of a great mission, the teacher's legacy, how genius ideas shouldn't rot in dust. She looked him in the eyes, and he drowned in their determination. He agreed. The night was dark and sticky. The building entrance smelled of cats and decay. They entered the apartment like thieves. Leo felt his heart pounding. The apartment without its owner felt dead. They stuffed briefcases and bags with priceless manuscripts. Leo handled each folder with reverence as if it were sacred. Irene worked quickly, efficiently, like an experienced looter. She knew what to take first, the finished chapters, the key findings. They hauled it all to Leo's place. His room became an annex of the professor's study. For months they sorted through the papers. It was a time both joyous and terrifying. Leo was obsessed. He lived Zaslavsky's thoughts, piecing together his grand vision. He believed they'd publish it under the professor's name, perhaps with a note, prepared for publication by his students. Irene worked alongside him. She typed, she organized, and then she began making edits. "You see, Leo," she'd say, "this concept of Arkady Borisovich's is a bit outdated here. They don't write like this anymore. We need to modernize it, make it more digestible for academic journals." Leo argued, insisting they couldn't distort the teacher's thoughts. But Irene was persistent. She said otherwise it would never get published, that the science bureaucrats wouldn't pass such raw material. Gradually, imperceptibly, she became not just an editor, but a co-author, and then the author. Professor Zaslavsky died a year later without regaining consciousness. 6 months after that, the country's leading academic journal published an article on the problem of Nostratic languages. Author: I. P. Voronin. The article caused a sensation. It was a bombshell. It was the quintessence of Zaslavsky's ideas, articulated in Irene's brilliant, modern, assertive language. The professor's name wasn't there, not in the text, not in the footnotes. When Leo saw the publication, his world split in two. He ran to Irene, the journal trembling in his hands. "What is this?" was all he could gasp. She stood in the middle of her room, not the dorm room anymore, but a new co-op she'd just moved into. She was calm. "This is science, Leo," she said, not looking away. "Science has no room for sentiment. I saved his ideas. In his form, they'd have rotted in an archive. I gave them life. And myself, too. But this is vile, Irene. It's betrayal. It's life." She cut him off. "You live in a world of books and illusions. I live in the real world. And in this world, the strongest and smartest win. I don't regret it. Arkady Borisovich is beyond caring, and his work will live, thanks to me." She said it so simply, so matter-of-factly that Leo felt sick. He looked at her and didn't recognize the girl with braids. Before him stood a stranger, a cold, successful woman. He understood Professor Zaslavsky had been right. He understood his love, his trust, his friendship had simply been used like old newspaper wrapping fish. He said nothing, just turned and walked away. He didn't shout, write exposés, or beat his head against the wall. His grief was quiet, like himself. He simply erased her from his life, burned all her notes, put away their photos, and he buried Zaslavsky's archive, the part he still had, deep within his bookcase and his memory. He could neither destroy it nor give it away. It was his cross. Years passed, decades. Irene Voronin built a dazzling career. Based on that first article, she earned her PhD, then her doctorate, wrote several monographs that became classics. She became a member of the Academy, traveled the world, won awards. Her name was renowned. Sometimes Leo saw her on TV. She'd aged, put on weight, but her eyes held the same cold, triumphant gleam. She never tried to contact him. Why would she? He was a witness to her original sin, and such witnesses are best kept at a distance. Leo lived his life. He married Kate, a colleague from the library. Kate was a simple, down-to-earth woman, but she possessed what Irene lacked, warmth and heart. She didn't ask about his past, sensing a locked room within him. She simply loved him, his quietness, his kindness, his sad eyes. Leo was grateful for this quiet harbor. He worked, read, raised his son. But every time he picked up an academic journal and saw the name Voronin, he felt the old predator inside him wake and bare its teeth. He didn't envy her fame. He despised her. A pure, distilled contempt, aged for decades like fine cognac. When the invitation to her anniversary gala arrived, his first impulse was to throw it away. Why? What was there for him? To witness her triumph built on the bones of his teacher and his own broken soul? But Kate, his wise Kate, said, "Go, Leo. You must, not for her, for yourself. Sometimes you need to look the enemy in the eye to know they can't hurt you anymore." And so he stood there in that hall full of falseness and flattery. Pompous words poured from the stage. They spoke of her genius, her breakthrough, her invaluable contribution. Some silver-haired academician, spittle flying, recounted how the young grad student Voronin, practically on sheer enthusiasm alone, had single-handedly revolutionized the field. Leo listened, his lips twisting into a grim smile. He alone in that room knew the true price of that revolution. The banquet was in full swing. The guest of honor, flushed with champagne and praise, descended from the stage into the hall. She moved surrounded by a retinue of admirers like a queen. And suddenly their eyes met. Across the room, over the heads, across 50 years. Leo didn't look away. He stared straight at her. He saw her face falter for an instant. She recognized him, hadn't forgotten. Something like confusion, maybe even fear, flickered across her face. But it lasted only a second. The professional smile snapped back into place, and she, gently disengaging from her entourage, walked straight towards him. The hall quieted, watching this scene, the great Voronin approaching some nondescript old man by the column. What did it mean? Leo stood motionless as a granite pillar. He felt like an actor in the final act of a play he hadn't written. Irene came close. She smelled of expensive perfume and success. She looked at him with eyes still bright, but now filmed with age. There was no remorse in them. There was curiosity, and perhaps the supreme condescension of the victor towards the vanquished. She wanted to put the final period, to get his silent forgiveness, to cleanse her biography completely. "Leo?" she said, as if she'd bumped into him on the street. "Leo Abramovich? What a surprise! How many years? I'm so glad to see you." A lie, thick as molasses. She knew he'd be here. She'd arranged the invitation herself. Leo remained silent. He just looked at her, and then she did what overflowed the cup of his long patience. She reached out her perfectly manicured hand and tried to take his. It was a gesture of reconciliation, a gesture meant to show her magnanimity to everyone. "Look, I even remember the most insignificant people from my past." At that moment, 50 years of silence in Leo's soul coiled into a single spring. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the bitterness of betrayal. He didn't pull his hand away. He made a slight forward movement, leaned close to her ear so only she could hear, and whispered softly, distinctly, pouring all the cold of his scorched soul into each word. "Not after all that's happened between us." He said it and straightened up. He saw the mask slip from her face. For a second, genuine, unfeigned horror was reflected there. Not fear of exposure, no. Who would believe him now? But horror at the realization that there existed something in the world that couldn't be bought, conquered, or talked away. There were things that were unforgivable. Never. The smile froze on her lips, twisting into an ugly grimace. Her hand hung helplessly in the air. And Leo Gelfand, without another word, without looking back, calmly and slowly turned and walked towards the exit. He walked through the buzzing hall, past astonished faces, through the thick smell of another's triumph. He felt no joy, no satisfaction, only a vast, ringing emptiness. The beast inside him had finally died. He stepped out into the frosty evening air, and immediately the clamour of the banquet hall, cloying and sticky like over-sweetened wine, fell away, like a phantom trail that dared not cross the threshold of the Writers' Guild. The city met him with its familiar, indifferent noise, the hum of tires on frozen asphalt, the distant wail of a siren, fragments of strangers' conversations. Leo Gelfand turned up the collar of his old but impeccably clean coat and walked on, not seeing the road. His feet carried him automatically towards the subway, along the route etched into his body by decades of daily commutes. The beast inside him was dead. Leo felt it with a detached, almost clinical certainty, where half a century ago a hot, pulsing something had nested a mix of resentment, humiliation, and cold, aged hatred. Now there was emptiness, not blessed silence, as weary souls dream of, but precisely emptiness, echoing, ringing, like an empty well. He had fired his last bullet, shot the only enemy who had given meaning to his inner war, and now stood alone on the battlefield, aimless, opponentless, in deafening silence. He felt no triumph. The phrase he'd thrown in Irene's face brought no relief. It wasn't an act of revenge, but a statement of fact, an exhale that had lasted 50 years. He had simply released the stale air from his lungs and moved on. What she felt, how her face changed, what the onlookers thought, none of it mattered any more. The play, as he'd thought, was over, but there was no applause, and the actor, wiping off his makeup, was left alone with his own exhaustion. On the subway car, smelling of wet wool and red Moscow perfume, which seemed likely to outlast Moscow itself, Leo sat on an empty seat and closed his eyes. Before his mind's eye, there was no Irene's face, no banquet hall guilt, only lines from Professor Zaslavsky's unpublished translations, fragments of his hypotheses, the intricate pattern of his thought, which Leo knew by heart like a prayer. He suddenly realized that all these years he hadn't been guarding his own violated honor so much as the memory of that great naive man. He had been the keeper of a tomb, and today he had finally sealed it and walked away. But what does a keeper do when the mission is done? At home, Kate was waiting. She hadn't slept, sitting in an armchair under a floor lamp, knitting in her hands. Hearing the key in the lock, she looked up. Her eyes, kind and perceptive, understood everything immediately. Not the details, not the facts, but the essence. She saw that her Leo had returned from the war. It didn't matter if he was victor or vanquished. He had returned. "Want some supper?" she asked, as if he'd returned from an ordinary walk. "There's potatoes with dill." Leo silently took off his coat, hung it on the rack, walked to the kitchen and sat at the table. Kate placed a plate of steaming potatoes in front of him, laid a fork beside it. She sat opposite, her cheek resting on her hand. She asked no questions. Her silence was healing. It enveloped and warmed him, filling the echoing emptiness he'd brought in from the street. "I saw her," he finally said, looking not at his wife but somewhere at the wall. "I know," Kate simply replied. "She came over, tried to take my hand." He gave a bitter, crooked smile. "I told her. A few words." "You did right," Kate nodded, and her voice held no trace of doubt. She didn't know what he'd said, but she knew he couldn't have done otherwise. Leo picked up his fork, speared a potato slice, but didn't put it in his mouth. "And that's it, Katyusha. That's all. Inside. It's empty." "Well, that's good, Leo," she said softly. "An empty place can be filled with something good. When there's a stone there, you can't put anything else. You've been carrying that stone for 50 years, finally dropped it. Now rest." He looked up at her, and for the first time that long, endless evening he felt the icy crust inside him begin to melt, not from joy, not from relief, but from simple human warmth. He wasn't alone. He had Kate. And that perhaps was the greatest victory of his quiet, unnoticed life. Meanwhile, in the banquet hall, the music hadn't stopped. For a second, when the great Irene Pavlovna Voronin froze with her hand outstretched and a dead smile on her face, and the unremarkable old man turned and walked away, an awkward pause hung in the air. But the retinue wasn't asleep. A fawning grad student darted forward, followed by the dean of philology, a woman in mauve. "Irene Pavlovna, are you feeling unwell?" "Oh, what a meeting! Who was that? An old acquaintance?" Irene slowly lowered her hand. The mask of the triumphant slipped for a second, was back in place, but it didn't fit as tightly. Her eyes, which moments before had flashed with terror, became cold and arrogant again, but deep within them lurked a tiny shard of fear, sharp as ice. "Oh, nothing," she tossed out casually, already turning to the dean. "Just some local eccentric." You know how it is at anniversaries for famous people, local eccentrics always turn up. He thinks he's an unrecognized genius and met the cause of all his misfortunes. The usual story. She said it loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. The lie was monstrous, but armored in such certainty that it was instantly believed. The dean nodded sympathetically. The grad student threw a contemptuous glance towards the exit. The incident was closed. The Queen adjusted her shawl with a light gesture and moved again through the crowd, accepting congratulations. But no one saw how her fingers trembled beneath the expensive fabric of her dress. No one heard how in her head, drowning out the music and voices, his quiet, lethal whisper echoed again and again, "Not after all that's happened between us." That phrase was more terrifying than any public accusation. An accusation could be refuted, ridiculed, the opponent destroyed by the force of her authority. But this whisper wasn't for the audience. It was for her. It was the key that unlocked that secret room in her soul, where her original sin had been stored for 50 years. She'd long learned not to enter that room, pretended it didn't exist. And now this quiet old man, this ghost from a past she thought long ground to dust, had walked up and flung the door wide open. She spent the rest of the evening on autopilot, smiled, nodded, gave thank-you speeches, drank champagne. But the champagne tasted like water, the compliments like white noise. She looked at the faces around her, obsequious, envious, adoring, and for the first time in many years felt a sharp, piercing loneliness. Her whole life, her brilliant career, all those prizes and titles, were built on a stolen foundation. She knew it, and now she knew there was still one other person in the world who knew it, and that person had not forgiven her. Returning late to her vast, echoing apartment overlooking the park, she didn't turn on the lights. She walked into the study lined with shelves holding her own books in gilded bindings. She went to the window and looked for a long time at the lights of the night city. "Local eccentric," she whispered into the darkness as if trying to convince herself. But the echo in the empty apartment answered her with silence. She wasn't a sentimental woman. Remorse belonged to Dostoevsky novels, not real life. But what she felt now wasn't remorse. It was fear. An irrational, cloying fear, not of exposure, but of something else. Fear that her whole life, built on denying the past, was an illusion. The past hadn't died. It had simply been waiting for its hour. She walked to the desk, turned on the lamp. Her hands, usually steady and sure, trembled slightly. She pulled open a desk drawer and took out an old address book, flipped through the pages. Gelfand, Leo Abramovich. Home address. Phone number. The entry was made years ago, just in case. She always planned for everything. She looked at the address, and a plan was already forming in her mind. Not a plan for revenge, a plan for sanitization, surgical removal of the splinter that had suddenly flared so painfully. She wouldn't let some pathetic failure, some library rat, destroy what she'd built her whole life. She hadn't climbed over heads only to stumble at the finish line over a ghost from the past. Tomorrow she would act. The next morning in the Gelfand apartment was like thousands before it. The creak of the floorboards, the smell of brewing tea, the ticking of the old clock in the living room. But the air was different. Leo woke with a feeling of lightness he hadn't known in years. He didn't, as usual, immediately reach for a book. He just lay there, looking at the ceiling, listening to Kate's peaceful breathing beside him. At breakfast they barely spoke, but the silence was comfortable. Kate put a small bowl of cherry jammies favorite on the table. That small gesture spoke louder than words. It told him, "I'm here. All is well. Life goes on." After breakfast, Leo did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He walked to the farthest bookcase, stood on a stool, and took down a large cardboard box tied with twine from the top shelf. The box was covered in a thick layer of dust. He brought it to the kitchen, set it on the table. Kate, washing dishes, turned around. "Is that it?" she asked softly. Leo nodded. He untied the twine, lifted the lid. Inside lay yellowed folders, Zaslavsky's manuscripts, the part of his archive Irene had deemed raw material, that fateful night drafts, notes she saw as worthless. She'd taken what could be quickly repurposed and claimed as her own, but here in this box lay the soul. Sketches, reflections, hypotheses, arguments with himself scribbled in the margins, the very essence of his genius. Leo opened a folder at random. His fingers, accustomed to old paper, gently touched the pages covered in the professor's cramped handwriting. He began to read, and forgot everything. Forgot Irene, the banquet, his emptiness. He was back there in the professor's smoke-filled apartment, hearing his voice, following the flight of his thought. The emptiness inside him began slowly to fill. Not with malice, not with resentment, but with a pure, bright joy of recognition. The joy of touching a great mind. He didn't notice an hour passing, then another. Kate quietly slipped out of the kitchen, leaving him alone with his treasure. She understood. Her Leo had found something to fill the empty space. He had returned to what he had truly loved. That same morning in her sterile apartment, Irene Voronin drank coffee and made calls. The first call was to the director of the institute, where she was formally listed as chief scientific consultant. "Nikolai Stepanovich, dear," she cooed into the receiver, "forgive the early call. I have a delicate request. Could you possibly pull the personnel file of a former employee?" "Gelfand. Leo Abramovich." "Yes, precisely. I've been informed he's spreading rather unflattering rumors about me. I'd like to have his full record on hand. To nip it in the bud, so to speak. Thank you, my dear. I'd be most grateful." The second call was to the editor-in-chief of the most prestigious historical philological journal. "Ivan Petrovich, hello. Voronin here." "Yes, thank you. The anniversary went splendidly. Listen, I have a question. Have you received any strange materials lately concerning the legacy of Professor Zaslavsky? No? Excellent. It's just there's this one. Overly excitable gentleman trying to latch onto someone else's glory. His name is Gelfand. If anything from him should arrive, please be so kind as to inform me. We must protect the purity of our science from crackpots and litigious types." She acted coolly and methodically, like a general fortifying her flanks. She wasn't attacking. She was creating a zone of exclusion around Leo, preemptively discrediting anything he might say or do. She knew. In their world, it wasn't truth that mattered, but reputation. And her reputation was impeccable, while he was nobody. An old man in a worn-out coat. Who would believe him? Hanging up, she felt better. Control was returning. She was once again the mistress of her life, her world. The whisper in her head grew quieter. She almost convinced herself yesterday's episode was an unfortunate misunderstanding she had almost resolved. Daniel Sokolov, a third-year grad student, was in despair. His dissertation on the problem of laryngeals in Professor Zaslavsky's later work was falling apart. He'd scoured all the published works of Voronin, considered the primary and only expert on the professor's legacy, but kept hitting logical inconsistencies, conclusions that seemed forced. He needed the original sources. But all of Zaslavsky's drafts and manuscripts, according to the official story, had burned in an archive fire in the early 70s. Voronin's anniversary had been his chance. He'd hoped to approach her, ask a few questions, maybe request a consultation. He'd stood all evening, unable to break through the tight ring of admirers surrounding the academic star. And he had witnessed the strange scene. He'd seen Voronin walk over to that quiet old man by the column, seen her face change when he whispered something in her ear, seen her momentary, genuine horror, and then heard her explanation about the local eccentric. And Daniel hadn't believed her. Something about the scene rang false. The old man's gaze there was no madness in it. There was a quiet, unshakable righteousness. And in academician Voronin's eyes, for a moment, there had been panic. Curiosity, the prime quality of a true scientist, took over. The next day, Daniel didn't go to the library. He went to the university archives. He spent hours poring over old enrollment records and personnel files of philology students from the 60s. He was looking for Zaslavsky's students, and he found them. Among dozens of names, 2 stood out, mentioned most frequently by the professor in his few published articles from that period: the bright, promising Irene Voronin and the quiet, thoughtful Leo Gelfand. Daniel found Gelfand's personnel file: straight A student, university scholar, recommendation for grad school signed by Zaslavsky himself, and then a strange note: not admitted to graduate studies at own request. Further on sparse lines: librarian, junior researcher, retired. Not a single publication, not one article. The man Zaslavsky called his most talented student had simply vanished from academia. At the very time his classmate Voronin began her triumphant ascent on the very topic the professor had apparently been developing. Daniel's heart beat faster. He felt he was onto the trail of something old and very ugly. He copied Leo Gelfand's address and phone number from the file. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just felt he had to talk to this man. Several days passed before he worked up the courage. He dialed the number several times and hung up. What would he say? "Hello, I'm digging into your dirty laundry. Want to help?" Finally, he decided to go for broke. He went to the address: a quiet city courtyard, an old brick building. Went up to the 3rd floor, stood before the door covered in brown leatherette, and pressed the bell. The door was opened by the same old man. He was wearing a sweater, glasses perched on his nose. His gaze was calm, slightly surprised. "Who are you looking for?" he asked. "Leo Abramovich?" Daniel stammered. "Hello, my name is Daniel Sokolov. I'm a grad student at Columbia. I'm writing my dissertation on Professor Zaslavsky's work." At the professor's name, the old man's eyes changed. Surprise gave way to guarded interest. "Go on," he said, not inviting him in. "Leo Abramovich, I saw you at Irene Pavlovna's anniversary. And I read your student papers in the archive, and the professor's recommendations. I have questions I can't find answers to in any book." Leo was silent, studying this young, rumpled guy with burning eyes. In him he saw something of himself. 50 years ago, the same thirst for knowledge, the same naive belief that truth mattered above all. A woman's voice came from inside the apartment. "Leo, who is it? Invite them in. Don't stand on the landing." Leo hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, letting Daniel into the hallway. They sat in the kitchen. That same Kate, the wise woman with kind eyes, poured tea for everyone. Daniel, nervous and stumbling, talked about laryngeals, the inconsistencies in Voronin's monograph, his feeling that some crucial part of Zaslavsky's legacy was lost or deliberately hidden. Leo listened in silence. He hadn't intended to tell anything. He'd lived with this secret his whole life and didn't want to get involved in scandals that couldn't change anything in his old age. But looking at this young man, he suddenly thought of something else. Not revenge, not justice, but the work of Professor Zaslavsky, which had been dearer to him than his own life. When Daniel ran out of steam and fell silent, waiting for an answer, Leo stood up, left the kitchen, and returned a minute later with that same cardboard box. He placed it on the table in front of the stunned grad student. I won't tell you any stories, young man, he said quietly but firmly. I'm too old for stories. But if you truly want to pursue science, not a career, then here. This is what you're looking for. The professor's drafts, his real thoughts. Daniel looked from the box to Leo, unable to utter a word. There's no proof here for a court or a newspaper article, Leo continued. Only science. Take it, study it, and if you're a true scholar, you'll understand everything yourself. Publish it, not as a sensation, but as scholarly work. Give back to the professor what was taken from him. That's all I ask of you. He said it, and his voice didn't tremble. He wasn't passing on a baton of revenge. He was passing on a baton of knowledge. He was freeing not only himself, but the professor, from half a century of captivity. Daniel left the Gelfans, clutching the priceless box to his chest like the greatest treasure. He was shaken to his core. On the doorstep, he turned. Leo Abramovich, thank you. I'll do it right. Leo just nodded and closed the door behind him. He returned to the kitchen. Kate looked at him with a quiet smile. You did right, Leo, she said again. I know, he replied, and for the first time in many years he smiled back at her. Lightly and freely. The beast was dead. The emptiness was filled. The play was over, and its ending had turned out unexpectedly bright. Ahead lay a quiet, calm life, with no room left for ghosts of the past, and somewhere in the city a young grad student was opening an old cardboard box, and the genius of Professor Zaslavsky was preparing for its second true birth. The fate of Irene Voronin no longer interested Leo. Her judgment wouldn't be delivered by him, but by history, and by the science she had so cynically exploited. And that, Leo knew, was the strictest and most incorruptible judge of all.